So far, we've only published SOAP services. Now we'll see how to publish REST services with Genexus, using the usual mechanism and also the API object, with all the advantages provided by this object. In Genexus, there are two ways to publish a REST service. One that we've already seen, which is to expose procedure objects, data providers, or business components using the expose as web services property set to true, and setting the REST protocol property set to true. Another way is using the API object, which is useful to expose procedure objects or data providers. This API object allows exposing services with REST or gRPC protocols, making it possible to group several services that are semantically or functionally related. The API object adds an intermediate layer that separates the interface from the implementation details, so that future programming changes to objects do not affect the way they're invoked by external applications. This allows for a mapping between the internal name of the object in the KB and the name used to expose it as a service, as well as changing the type and name of the parameters, or changing the access path without affecting the way in which the service is invoked. This abstraction provides significant flexibility because we can involve our services without forcing the applications that use them to change their code to adapt to the changes. For that reason, to expose procedures and data providers as REST services, it's strongly recommended to always use the API object instead of the expose as web service and REST protocol properties. To test what we've seen, let's create an API object to publish the two methods we had to get attraction data by country as REST services. We call the API object getAttractionsInfo. The API object has three parts: service source, events, and variables. In the service source section, we define, using a declarative syntax, the name of each service to be published, with the corresponding parameters, specifying whether each parameter is input or output, and the name of the Genexus object in our KB that we're exposing as a service, with its corresponding parameters. Here we're exposing the getAttractionsByCountry service based on the getAttractionsByCountry WS procedure. The parameters match. Similarly, below we're exposing the procedure getAttractionsByCountry with trips WS as a service, with the name getAttractionsByCountry and trips, and the parameters we expose are the same as those of the procedure object. In the future, this definition will allow us to change the name or parameters of the Genexus object without changing the definition of how this object is published. In the events, we have the before and after event, with which we can perform actions that are executed before or after the invocation of the object as a service. We also have before and after events for each exposed service. In these events, it's not possible to access the database. If it's required, it must be included in the code of the procedure or data provider exposed as a service. In the variables, there are some under the group of standard variables, which allow us to know or change characteristics of the API object at runtime. The variable program name contains the name of the object, program desk contains the description of the object, and REST method contains the HTTP method with which the object was called. This variable is empty when the object is called using a protocol other than REST. Also, the REST code variable is used to set the HTTP status code, depending on what the service invocation returns. In our example, if we do not find any attraction for the given country, we could assign the REST code variable the value 404, not found. As we said before, the API object allows us to change the name of a parameter. To do so, we must assign the external name property of the variables used in the parameters of the exposed service. In the example that we saw, if we go to the variables of the API object getAttractionsInfo, we select the country ID variable, and in the external name property, we write ID. The URL with which the service will be invoked, instead of using the name country ID for the parameter, we'll use the name that we defined as external name. The word ID will appear instead of country ID. To change the default URL of an API object, we can do it by changing the value of its service's base path property. By default, this property has the name of the API object. If we enter another text, that text will appear in the URL instead of the name of the object. Another thing we can do with the API object is to read the data from the header of the invocation to our REST service. If any parameter is received in the HTTP header of the service, using the before event, we can read the header that's sent by the application that invokes the service when it makes the request. The text expression used between the brackets of the getHeader method determines the name of the HTTP header. These headers, which are invisible to the end user, define how information is sent or received from the service. For example, who's calling the service, host name, access credentials, connection type, cookies, and so on. In this case, the header is named user agent, and the value returned is a text string that identifies the user agent to the server. In other words, the name of the client application that's invoking the service. With the API object, if we included an annotation prior to the definition of the service, we can specify the HTTP access method. Let's suppose that we have two services, one named getAttraction to obtain data from a specific tourist attraction through a data provider, and another named insertAttraction, which allows us to create a new attraction to the database through a procedure. For example, in the case of the getAttraction service, we're specifying that the get method will be used to invoke it, since we're obtaining information through the service. The annotation goes between straight brackets. It'll contain a REST method, and between brackets, the HTTP method to use, in this case, get. In the example, the internal method to be executed is that of the data provider getAttractionInfo.ws. Since data providers return information, they're invoked by default as get, and with the annotation, we're making this explicit. The insertAttraction method that inserts an attraction into the database is invoked with a post, using the REST method post annotation. The createAttractionWS object, since it's a procedure, can be invoked as get or as post. In this case, we invoke it explicitly as post because it will be saving information in the database. By using the standard REST code variable of the API object, we can change the HTTP status code. We do this in the events, and we can do it before invoking the service, in a before event, to set a value in case it's already determined that the service cannot be invoked because the received data is not correct. In the code, we're assigning the HTTP status code 412 precondition failed if the attraction ID received as parameter is not valid. And we can also do it after executing the service to establish the result of the operation. For example, if the required information was not found. In the example, the information received has the attraction ID field empty, so no information was found for an attraction with the attraction ID passed as parameter. Therefore, we assign the REST code variable with the value 404, not found. In this video, we saw the flexibility of the API object to publish REST services. To learn more about this object, you can visit the wiki.